I'm Deborah Nowers. I'm the vice president of this illustrious group. And since Janine is my friend, I get the introduction. Janine Carpenter is a Searsport resident, lives in an historic house in Searsport, and inherited a project, I think, from your mother to work on, nope, to work on plaques? Okay. Okay. Anyway, she started by working on name plaques for the houses with their dates, and that involves incredible amounts of history and research to find out who owned it, when, where, when it was built, when it went from being an empty lot to being a lot with a house on it. And then there are stories that go with it. But there's also techniques that she has worked, and she works in the Penobscot Marine Museum the same day I do. So I've learned lots from Janine about how to do house research. Okay, you're on, Janine. Turn myself on.
So thank you. When Deb asked me if I would do this, I kind of went, oh no, because how do you put together all this work? She was helpful in a comment she made to me, which was, they'd probably be more interested in the processes that you use versus the house stories, because you're not all from Searsport. So what I've done, for those of you who are from Searsport, is it does focus, and thank you for coming and supporting me, it does focus on the processes, the resources and materials I use. So basically what you're going to see is our houses between about 1840 and 1905, plus or minus. You have to narrow the scope. It did come from house plaques, which in town the house must be 100 years or older. But I was really interested in who were those people that made Searsport what they are. We seem to know a lot about the fact that there were captains in the town, but those boats didn't float without a lot of other people supporting them. And my interest was, what are the connections between those that sailed and those that lived in town, and what they did and what their community was like. And what I've learned from this is that houses truly do tell stories. So why do I do it? Because every single town has a story to tell, and every house has a story to tell. And it doesn't matter how old or how new it is. Every house story helps to tell the town story, and house stories weave together and really create a story about the culture of a place, which, when you really start digging into this, it is amazing about the life that was Searsport during that time. So the goal is to capture the story, and you capture the story through tracking the story. And it's really important for a lot of reasons to document the story. I learned that a little bit too late. You know, for a while I wasn't taking good enough notes, and I had to go back, and finally I said, I need a system. So a lot of what you're going to see today is the system. It requires a lot of scrap paper. A lot of scrap paper. Anything I get in the mail that has a blank on one side gets cut up and stapled together and ripped off, and I feel good about that. So a lot of times when people go through Searsport, they see the big ones, you know, and you see the big names, the McGilverys, the Nichols, the Pendletons. And they're beautiful and they're wonderful. And these stories need to be kept also, because as time is going by, the stories are less current and they begin to fade. You know, it's kind of becomes watercolor versus strong oils. So it's all important. But then the question is, whose houses are these? Who built them? Who lived there? What's their story? Why were they there? So my focus has been really on these kind of unknown, more known to some, but not all. And it just gets really interesting when you see who these people were and what they did and how they interacted with town, the people in town. So my goal today is to show you the processes and resources used to capture the story, to document the story, and then later how to tell the story once you have it. If you have any questions, I like questions. Questions always spark good thinking, so please ask. And I'm not always going to bring it up, but I'm trying to show you the resources that I use. I use a lot of old maps. I use a lot of old documents. For instance, this is the 1875 Leggett map, and it's newer than many that I use. But this was my quote unquote original plan. I live on Water Street, and my goal was to start with one house, expand to one street, expand to 4 blocks, because there are a lot of houses in that space that are 100 years or older. That was the original plan. And then it captures you. You get hooked and you start looking and people talk to you and it just grows. So these are the resources that I use over and over and over again. They're pretty much self-explanatory. You're probably familiar with a lot of them. So I'm not going to go through them one by one, but I'm going to tell you that this is the most important resource here. It takes a lot of time. I often, by people who know me, they call me crazy because of the amount of time it takes. But then we come with a good story, and they're just go, well, what happened there? And you go, well, that's what time gets you. So these are the things that I use, and I'm going to also say that the people that I work with, the help I get at the museum, the Penobscot Marine Museum, both in the people that work there as well as volunteers, people that just help with the photographs, people that find houses for me that are important, people that I work with are hugely important. So this is your goal. Your goal is to have a starting point, and you get a grantor, a grantee, a year, a book, a date, a type, a detail, and you just are supposed to just climb that ladder. You know, put on your climbing shoes and just climb that ladder, and it's supposed to be straight, right? No. This is what it usually looks like. You get a house, you get an address, and then you go in circles. And you go in circles until certain facts just start fitting together, and you say, okay. And this is what happens more often than not. But I'm going to take you back to a relatively easy house, just to walk through an easy process first. Now, how do you start? Initially I chose, but then other people say, I'm really interested in a house plaque. Can you help me with my house? And I say to them, well, give me what you have. Just give me what you have, and we'll see where it goes. And then the third thing is sometimes circumstances choose, and this is becoming more and more important. This house is slated for demolition. So, and it's a very important house on the east side of town. It's a park residence, which was a big family in Searsport during that time. Many farmers, captains, you name it, they did everything in town. And unfortunately, it's no longer physically stable. So it was important to just gather as much as we could this year about this particular house. My starting point is usually an address, which then takes me to the town tax commitment book. And from the town tax commitment book, I generally go to the Waldo County Deed office, and I end up going that route. That's for an easy one. But again, the information or the path that you take through this can come from a variety of different directions. So this is an easy one, or relatively easy. This is 9 Mount Ephraim Road. I'm in the county deed office, and this is the form that I use. Everyone, and I didn't always have this, and I didn't always keep it up right from the beginning, and I always had to backtrack. So now I keep this up right from the beginning. So I start with the current name, the latest grantee, and I work back. And you'll notice there's really nothing here yet because there's not information that I need yet there. I know it's the house, I know it's the address, it's relatively current, you just keep going. So then you go back and you keep going back until you start seeing description in the deeds that allow you to say, this is the piece of property. Not always easy. This one is particularly easy because they're using rods and links. I had to figure out what that was and keep that in my brain. Because sometimes it's, you know, to the left of a yellow pine tree and by a stake and stone, by a rock. And you're just saying, okay, I need something to just dawn on the situation here to clarify it. So in this case, we're all the way back, we're back to 1845. Andrew Leach is a big player in town. He bought a, right now, the best way to tell you where it is, it's where the Maine Port Brewery is. It's that corner. And that was known as Dudley's Corner. And Mr. Dudley ran the mills on the mill stream that you cross, which is where East Belfast split from Searsport in 1845. So he, and Deb, Mrs. Dudley has, is it Mrs. Dudley that's in Elmwood with the stone we found? Yeah. But even one of the oldest stones in Elmwood is the Dudley stone, and it needs repairing. So we're going to work on that. We're going to work on that. That's on our list. Anyway, so Adolphus Spring, who were the Dudley children's guardians, sold Andrew Leach this corner, which was known as Dudley's Corner. And he had the place where the brewery is, and then he had back along Mount Ephraim Road, and I believe across the street as well, although I haven't gotten that one yet. But here is where we are beginning to see that we have the same piece of property, and here we have no house, and here we have a house. And so we know from that is the house was built between 1845 and 1848 when he sold it. And if you go back to the deed, and the deed said was bought in February or an early month, in general, those houses started being built that year. This house is interesting too, because there are actually two houses that look almost identical to each other, right next to each other. And this house is, everything up there is north to me, but this house is north of the other house. And Andrew Leach's son-in-law lived in the other house, and this house, the house in front of it, and the building on the corner was all built by brick, probably brick from Andrew Leach's brickyard, which is near the old schoolhouse. It's not in existence anymore, but there was a brickyard just behind there, so it's very possible that this brick came from Andrew Leach's brickyard. So this house is going to receive a plaque that says 1845. Because that's when it was started. Might not have been finished then, but it was started. But that's not really the end of it, because you can't just find the house. You have to check when the house was built. And here, I'm sorry, this house, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. This house is 1846, because in the tax records in 1845, now we don't know exactly when those tax records were written, but in the tax records, there was no house on that piece of property. And but in 1846, there was a house. If you go back to this, here's Elbridge Dickey, who bought the property from Andrew Leach. And then you go to his tax records, and it shows his record for paying taxes. And then over here, this is a census record from 1850, which shows that, and this threw me off for a while. It shows that he was a farmer. So I said, well, where's his land? You know, because that wasn't exactly a farm. But interestingly enough, he was a farmer. And in 1850, he's listed right next to Joseph Park, who was Andrew Leach's son-in-law. Now, of course, as you know, census records are not always one after another. Somebody might not have been home and they go back, and we understand that, but this is pretty good evidence. And then the other thing that I often do when I'm cross-checking myself is I draw pictures, because pictures allow me to match up property next door and verify the property that I'm looking at. So if all of a sudden, this is the house we're doing, if all of a sudden this didn't line up, then I need to look again and say, have I gone down a wrong rabbit hole? So this one has different names on it because, again, initially the Elbridge Dickey name just didn't fit with me because he was a farmer and I was trying to push him out of the neighborhood. I didn't want him there. He needed farmland, but he lived there because his deed record shows that he sold the house to Joseph Park, and then Joseph Park sold it to Charles Whitney, and Charles Whitney sold it to Elijah Hopkins, and then James Nichols. So that's the right house. So all of these things, this is the Searsport tax records that are in the Penobscot Museum. This is just census information available online. What was interesting about him is when he sold the house, I said, well, where did he go? He just disappeared. He disappeared out of Searsport. So where did the Searsport person go? And I found him in Iowa. And he was a farmer in Iowa. So hence, yes, he was a farmer, even in Searsport. And he was really a pretty significant person. He was a councilman in Grinnell and justice of the peace. And then his son was also farming some pretty good land out there. And he was considered an original settler of that area. So here's another family. This is one of those. This is one of those. This family is the Lanfer family. And the Lanfer family was on East Main Street. And I knew from the old maps, here's Augustus Lanfer. He had one of the 100-acre lots originally, right on the bay. And he lived here, and then he ended up selling some of his property to his brother, Captain Elijah Lanfer. And this is Augustus Lanfer. And then, who's John Mason? Well, John Mason is their brother-in-law, obviously married to the sister. So to get what I'm trying to show you with this spreadsheet is this family, this spreadsheet actually tells you a lot about the family. They had a lot of land. They married people who had land, and they sold a lot of land back and forth. In order to keep track of the land, every color represents a piece of land. So all the pink is one piece of land, and all the yellow or the light yellow is one piece of land, and the dark yellow is one piece of land. And then these maps are important because some of the deeds refer to land that's another sister and her husband, Thomas True, lived in land that was adjacent to Samuel Snow's land. So that puts them right up here, which is diagonally up from the basic Lanfer land. They all lived around each other. One other brother, William Lanfer, also a captain, lived further up East Main on the same side of the road. This was a pretty close family. You actually don't see a lot about them in the newspapers, which I always look for. They just kept amongst themselves, and they were mainly coasters. They mainly sailed the coast versus ocean going. And their houses are still there, all next to each other. They don't look exactly the same because changes have been made over the years, but they're there. So in between 1802 and 1939, there are 66 Lanfer deeds, of which 30 are between Lanfers themselves. So that's plowing through a lot of deeds to get to the bottom line that yes, they did live here. Yes, these were their houses, and their houses, the two houses on the right side were built around 1846. But that was, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, good question. Route 1's probably down around here. Yep. Yep. I don't yet because the rain has not been cooperating. I go out and then I am sunk, and I can't have all pictures with gray skies. So I had to intersperse some. That's the, yeah. So in addition to looking at maps, there's a line, and you can see that as you're working through, you have to have something that you can put the connections that you find in the deeds on. So I constantly ask a friend of mine to create these maps for me. And this is all of this. The Eunice Lanfer was married to John Mason. He's the first one in the line of three. Abigail Burdick was married to Thomas True. She's the one who lived next to in the snow lot. We have William C., who lived a little bit further up the road, and who was married, was married first to Mary Turner and then to Sarah Turner. And then we have Augustus, who was married to Eliza, and Elijah, who was married to Maria Savory. So that is the Lanfer family. So these houses are, let me just go back. When we, I want to go back one or two times. Let me just I won't be long. I want you to notice, one more. Oh, I didn't put it on there. This house at one point was owned by Elijah Hopkins, who was a doctor in Searsport. And I'm bringing it up for a reason, because we're going to get back to him in a minute. These two houses are next door to each other on East Main Street. The one on the left is Daniel S. Simpson's house, built around 1860, and then the one on the right is Wilson C. Nichols' house, which he sold to George McClure, both ship captains. He sold it in 1862. The interesting story on this one is he sold this house in 1862. He might have been going to sea, but I can't find him anyplace else right now. But in 1874, Sarah Nichols Simpson, Wilson Cunningham Nichols' sister, sold her house to her brother. Does that make sense at all? This sister sold her brother a house next door to each other. And they lived there. Wilson Cunningham Nichols ended up dying at sea, but his wife lived in this house until in the 1900s. So if Daniel Simpson and his wife Sarah Nichols sold this house, where did they go? That was the question. Well, Daniel actually ends up being a fairly easy guy to follow because he is a very, very busy man. He went and built a house on Mossman Street in 1876. He bought the property from Fitzhoward Mossman, and the property was supposed to be conditioned that the premises shall only be occupied for a private residence and no stable within 40 feet of the street. So Daniel built this house after he left the last house. This was truly serendipity for me. I read a lot of newspapers. And in this newspaper on that day, I was looking for something else. And it says, today, Monday, Mr. Daniel S. Simpson has broken ground for the cellar of his private residence, which he will build in the present season. You don't get much more specific than that. You want that to happen every day. It doesn't. So this is Daniel S. Simpson's house, which the brick house, as I said, was owned by Elijah Hopkins at one point. Elijah Hopkins ended up buying this house. So you're getting a sense of how things went. And often, neither of these were ship captains, but often houses were rented a lot when people went to sea. So it's not unusual for people to end up in different houses. Now, Daniel Simpson is truly a busy guy. In 1848, he married Sarah Nichols. This is when he built the house next door to Wilson C. Nichols. He was a Civil War veteran. He was a recruiting officer. He runs for Senate. This is where he sold his house to Sarah's brother. He breaks ground for his house on Mossman Street. His daughter, Ida Simpson, marries at the house on Mossman Street. It is in the newspaper. And then in 1885, unfortunately, this man was involved in a lot of stuff. The house was foreclosed on. So he lost that house and ended up in another, according to the census, in another location in Searsport, but ultimately moved to Massachusetts, where he lived with his daughter and her husband, and that's where they died. Not really house history, but in 1900, the reason this is how the story works for this one. In 1900, there was in Boston a lot of people who were leaving Searsport for a variety of reasons, business, whether they were there long-term or as the sailing industry became smaller. They moved to the Boston area and they formed something called the Boston Home Club. So even though they lived in Boston, they were very, very, very close-knit. So in 1886, the Searsport Savings Bank, which foreclosed on that house, was sold to Dr. Elijah Hopkins, the same person who had the brick house for a while. And he was married to Cynthia Adams of Camden, and their daughter, Ella, was married in the house in 1906, and this is a description of the wedding that took place in that house. What's really interesting about this is it allowed the opportunity to find this survey, an 1855 survey in the deed office, which was developed by somebody, developed for the Mossmans in order for the Mossmans to sell the property, some of which is now Mossman Park. So if the Mossmans had followed through completely with this survey, we would have lost Mossman Park in Searsport, which would have been really tragic. But what's interesting is when Daniel Simpson built the house, he had one of those lots. And then Cynthia and her brother came along. And with her brother's help, she purchased all the rest of these lots. And that's why this is a beautiful property down there. And the reason is because Cynthia bought all those lots with her brother's help. So, and it remains that way. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sure. She's asking whether the bays were original or whether they were added. We believe in this house, the bays are original. In many houses, they're added, but in this house, we believe they're original. Yeah. So this is, as I said, 1855. They were really going to, it's one of the original subdivisions. These lots are really quite small, but she bought all of those lots with her brother's help and ended up with a property that exists today. So this is another house which is actually an interesting house because everybody calls this the Curtis house, and rightfully so in one respect. The family that lived here, the Curtis family, had this house for over 100 years. And that's how everybody in town knew, and everybody knew the Curtises. So it was called the Curtis house. But then when the person who lives in it now said, I want a house plaque, and we started looking into this house, I said, not so sure about this being the Curtis house. In other words, did the Curtises live in it, or are you saying they built it? So it really goes back to these dates being important. The property was sold in 1835, and it went through a number of hands in between 1835 and 1870. But in 1870, in the paper, the house, barn, and outbuildings of Mr. Foss Hamilton of Searsport were burned to the ground. So he lived on Mount Ephraim Road. He had a slaughterhouse and a farm, and he lost it all. And the loss was $3,500. He was insured for $500. Well, they had no place to live. So they moved to this location in 1870, not this house, this location. So and guess what he paid for this location in 1870? $500. He paid this much money for that property, but it wasn't this house. So through the years, looking at the tax records again, you can see that there was, for instance, one year he wasn't being taxed. It just said repairing. They were repairing an old house and he wasn't taxed. But in 1883, Emily Hamilton deeded, Foss Hamilton's wife deeded Charles Hamilton this house and stated in the deed, being my homestead. Well, it was until 1891 when all of a sudden the house that was became this house. Or it started becoming this house because Charles ended up being one of those people who went to Boston. He went to Boston and he was the he worked for the wealthiest man in Boston, managing his properties at that point. So he really didn't need this property anymore. He took out a mortgage in 1892 and he rebuilt this house. And in 1893, he sold it to the Curtis family. So that's the story of this house. So the plaque that's going to go on that house for 1893 is going to read the Hamilton Curtis house. The rationale being, without Hamilton, you wouldn't have the house, but the Curtises were a very big, it still are, a very big family in Searsport. And interestingly enough, when the Curtises had this house, they brought property around this house, not unlike Mrs. Hopkins. They brought property around this house and had things torn down and phrases put in deeds saying you can't block my view to the bay. So it's an important house, and many people knew this house. I don't have the date when the I'm not sure when this house transferred, but it's relatively recently. So there's a lot of memory of the people that lived in this house. All right, and this is just showing the tax records, which shows repairing, no house value. Here are the house and barn in the north side. It's worth $200. The following year, there was a mortgage, and then the following year, we have a house that's worth $1,000. So that's the history of it in deeds. The Hamiltons were they had a slaughterhouse, they were grocers, they were farmers, they had this there was one story in the newspaper that they had a really huge like candy cane or something in their store, but they were an important family as well. So when I first started out, I was focusing on Water Street and I just tried to figure out what was going on. And the reason I'm showing you this is sometimes you just need to have a visual. So this is a picture of the land on which my house and many other houses are built. When it was sold from Alfred Johnson to Isaac Carver, and originally went to him from Richard Smith in 1837. It's a 3-acre lot that that later on got divided. When this was in here, on all of the deeds, there was land that was set aside to become the road that is now Water Street. It was a 2-rod wide strip of land. But to see that, all of a sudden it makes sense. So now I'm going to show you 3 houses on Water Street that are these 3 houses. And there's an old postcard. Again, you use all the tools you can get. I'm going to talk about this house first, and then this house, and then this house. But what was really nice is that there were a lot of postcards of Water Street, so that was really helpful. That's me doing that, isn't it? I'm sorry. This is 7 Water Street, which the house was built by Eliab Stevens in 1854. But the story in this house is really the Sullivan story. And what I wanted to show you, the purpose of showing you this one is just the number of resources that are available to tell this story. Their stones actually have where they were from in Ireland. You know, that's just such a gift. And then the other thing is that Daniel Sullivan was a shoemaker and worked for over 50 years in Searsport. And here was his store in an old photograph that's at the museum. And if you look closely, it says D. Sullivan, boots and shoes. And then you go to his obituary, and he was obviously a well-regarded man because they talked about he worked for nearly 50 years. And the sentence that I particularly like is, men who have grown gray as mariners, as boys had their first long-legged boots made by Mr. Sullivan, who afterwards fitted them out with their sea boots when they made their first voyage. You know, that's who he was. And then his son took over the business from him. The next house I'm going to show you is the one that was down here, which was originally built for Isaac Carver III, and has been owned by a number of mariners. In 1894, was bought by Miss Lucia W. Edwards, who was a milliner and a dry goods dealer. And she had a store on Main Street, which if you look really closely, it says L.W. Edwards and L.W. Edwards. And so that's where initially she was on the 2nd floor, but it appears that she moved down to the 1st floor. And this is the 1878 business record, which lists her business in it. So these are, again, pulling all of the resources. Yeah. Opposite side of the street. Opposite side of the street. Yep. So here's her census, and this was interesting. In 1870, she lived at the Searsport house. She came from away, and she lived at the Searsport house. She boarded there. And then in 1880, in the census, she boarded with J.H. Lane, who was a merchant in town. And she was listed as a dry goods dealer. And then in 1900, she was on Water Street. And also in 1910 and in the 1920s, she had passed away. So she's not in the census anymore. But that's how you marry the resources and the data that you can pull. And having these kinds of resources available is just, they're priceless. So we all know that obituaries really give some great information, but it's just one more opportunity to say that she lived on Water Street because she passed away at her house. But it also just tells her story. And one of the things she's known for, and I really should let Deb tell the story because Deb reenacted Lucia. Would you like to tell the story? Oh, sorry.
I got involved with Lucia because I was doing, I was asked to do a reenactment for the Penobscot Museum. Penobscot Marine Museum does them. And so I did my research on Lucia, and I liked the fact that she was a single woman. She never married. She ran her millinery business. And during the Civil War, she was asked to learn how to do Morse code. And so she would get the reports from the battles in the Civil War, and she would stand on her front step, which makes me think she must have been on the 1st floor at that point. But anyway, that was the description. She stood on her step and she gave the news of the war. And part of it was that, you know, as like most Maine towns, there were tons of boys from Searsport who were fighting in the Civil War. And I laughed. It's one of those things. I'm interested in her mostly because she was a single woman. She came from Brooks, and she wasn't going to be a milliner in Brooks. So she moved to where the rich women were in Searsport. But at the time she died, she had shares in the savings bank and she owned her own house. I think that's a pretty impressive for a woman who made her own life.
So this is kind of the house that started it, but it's also the house with the missing deed. We have all the deeds on this house, with the exception of giving me an exact date of when it was built. I believe the builder was John Carr, but the date that it was built, the 1847, is missing. So this is when you get into that question of what are you going to put on a house for a date? If we don't have a year build, we put a circa date on it, just a C and then a date, because we're trying to be as accurate as possible. And we always say to people, you never know when more information is going to pop up. You just never know. So you kind of hope that that's going to happen at some point. But until it does, the house gets a circa date. This is the house of Elijah Dunbar. And Elijah Dunbar was a master builder, which means he basically oversaw a crew of builders. Nobody worked in just one shipyard for the most part. He went where the job was. He went to different shipyards and he worked. And then as he got older, he lived in the house from 1847 to 1902. He had two wives, both of who predeceased him, and his son Norman Dunbar became a captain, he ended up living in Santa Cruz, California. But Elijah Dunbar did more. But in looking for Elijah's story, all of a sudden you realize what you can look at to find these stories. So this is Elijah Dunbar's stone, and both his wives are buried with him. He's in Village Cemetery. He needs work too. But these are two of the, he was the master builder for the Goodall, and he was the master builder for the Emma F. Harriman. This happens to be the painting, which is rather dramatic, but happens to be in the Museum of American History. When his obituary came up, it's there. And in his later career, he was a manager of the McGilvery and Company Marine Railway, which is where they pulled the ships out. And this one was to be repaired, and this one was in Brewer. So this is my favorite story. Elijah Dunbar's black horse was driven from Monroe Fairground last Thursday to this place, a distance of 12 miles, with two of our citizens representing 1/4 of a tons of weight in 1 hour. Who needs a roadster? Oh, yeah, and even this is interesting because Dunbar went with a group of Searsport shipbuilders to South Carolina to build a vessel. So when I was looking for information, and they built two, but when I was looking for the information, I ended up finding information about it from a historian that wrote from South Carolina. So that kind of tied it together in Bucksville, South Carolina. So this interests me a lot because it kind of speaks to the fact that wherever you live in Searsport and whatever your occupation was and all of that, there was a really great loyalty to the town, to the point where 250 people in Boston got together regularly for a period of time to tell stories and bring the memories of their childhood, growing uphood back together again. And if you'll notice, remember, Daniel Simpson was a very busy guy. Here he is. He spoke about part of the town's war record. So he was there. Many of the names were there. And then no one will be left out if the committee can avoid it. Mount Ephraimites, Harborites, people from Sergeant Nichols, Gordon, Ralstone, and Porter districts, and the Cornerites. They're all working together to make this happen. This club existed for a number of years. And I think, it really just stopped existing when those people started dying, essentially. But this was in the Boston Herald in 1901. So these are some of those houses. This house, Benjamin Merrithew, was built by Lewis Patterson in 1845, but he was a fisherman and he lived in the neighborhood with everybody else. There was fishermen, lived with captains, lived with carpenters, lived with you know, coopers and blacksmiths. So this person really wanted a sign for their house, and they really wanted it Benjamin Merrithew. And we said, well, we're really trying to keep the person who built the house or who it was built for. So she has a sign that says Lewis Patterson, 1845 in the front of her house. And she has a sign that says Benjamin Merrithew, fisherman, on the back of her house. Because there was a shop in the house. And it's very obvious. This is Eliphalet Eaton, my favorite all-time name. Try saying it like 5 times in a row. This house is currently, was just bought. I'm really thrilled about that. It's got this wonderful roof line, and he was a ship carpenter in 1851, and his son, Oscar Eaton, was a captain. And, you know, this is a typical family in that he was a carpenter, there was a captain in the family, they had a daughter who died when she was 16 years old from one of the illnesses that ran through. Yeah, and it's just, and they live like right down near the water. This is Dennis Griffin's house. He was a master mariner. This is Henry Harriman's house. He's North Searsport, and this is these deeds were fun to read because he was a blacksmith, and when he bought 2 pieces of property. One was somebody's blacksmith shop, which he bought, but in the deed it references the town watering trough, you know, so you really get a sense of the town. And the other thing is what's also neat about this house is that he started here. It talks about when he built it talks about in the newspaper when he built a barn, and then he left and went to work for his father in Belfast, but decided he wanted to be in Searsport, so he came back to Searsport, and he originally had a blacksmith shop in town, and then he moved back and he practiced his craft in up Mount Ephraim Road. And this is Oliver Johnson, his house, who is on East Main Street, and he was a cooper. And his daughter married somebody who lives on West Main Street. So we know, and the wife of Oliver Johnson ended up living with her daughter on West Main Street. So that's it. That's what I have. Yes.
The first map that you showed, the very beginning of the talk.
Yeah.
What's the name of that? What's the origin of it? Showed the whole town.
Yes.
Back.
I'm trying to,
Yeah.
What I'm going to say to you is check the town website, because it's
Okay.
just a map that's dated. It's not a map that, I don't know that it has an attribution, but it is an historic. If I went to the town website right now, I could show it to you.
Okay. 'Cause that was a good map.
It was a good map, and it's a very accurate map for the age of it. Yeah. And if I went there, I could find it for you, but
The name on the bottom.
then that's where I'm going. As an inset. Oh, no. It's the wharf.
It's part of it's down in one thing.
I believe this is the one that's hanging in the library, isn't it? Is this the one that's hanging? That's 1875. Yeah, okay. Yep. Yep.
That map on the big map.
Yeah, this this map is 1875. I know who you are. Yep.
So one of our biggest things.
Wait, hold on, Megan.
Great presentation. Thank you very much. I go through the same thing. It's amazing how lost you can get, and then you walk away and then you say goodbye and then you come back. Lots of little pieces of paper. So so did you come across the same thing when they changed all the house numbers in the mid 1990s for the E911? And then of course the post office immediately forgot what all the house numbers were.
I don't use
So-
house numbers.
So I was curious about that. You just, because
I use house
sometimes,
numbers to start, like if I drive
Yeah.
by a house and I like the house and I think it looks, has potential interest, I'll note the number.
yeah.
But
But then how do you go back?
deeds,
The old,
just this person
figuring out
sold
the
through-
old numbers. So you just go, oh,
I don't
through
even
through
use
the deeds.
numbers.
Wow. Well, we have a lot of those directories. So you can go back some, okay.
You have more resources when it comes to that
I was
than we
curious
do.
about, I was curious about that, yeah.
Yeah, in fact, the book that you have, is it the fire maps book you have?
Sanborn
Yeah, we don't
insurance
have-
maps, yeah.
I've been looking for that.
They
We
don't
don't
have
have them.
them.
No,
Yeah.
and there really isn't anything that, as you know, they only started putting numbers in census books at a certain point in time. So there's
Yeah,
really no
yeah.
point in using them. And what I'm really looking for is the language in the deed,
Yeah,
which
exactly.
says this is what it is.
And who is here and who is here.
Yeah,
And yeah.
and
yeah.
all the time, which is all the little maps that you draw on all the scratch
Yeah.
paper that you end up throwing out or not.
Yeah, you got that right.
Help me, a little help. Sanborn maps, a lot of them have been scanned and put online through
Yes.
the University of Maine. That isn't complete, obviously. It's
Yeah,
the
and it's
collection
not
they have.
complete. It's not complete to the point where, when you get beyond a certain, the urban
Yeah,
is there,
yeah,
but the
yeah,
town
they
is
only-
not.
That's
yeah.
why they were there. They were for fire
Yeah.
insurance reasons, so.
Although they were really,
So,
those
yeah.
maps were really helpful when I was doing research on the mills on the stream, because
yeah.
that is
This
urban,
is-
and it literally drew the shape of the building, which allowed you to really understand the houses that were around it as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you again, Janine.